Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and this is Headlines in History from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, where we digest the most important updates from the world of diplomacy and foreign policy.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
All right, Tristen, how's it going, man? Been a couple weeks.
Yeah, very, very well. Busy couple of weeks. Most excitingly, we announced the 2026 iteration
Yes,
of
I saw that,
our
yeah.
diplomatic academy. This year going to be held, or I guess in 2026, indeed, next year going to be held at Rhodes House in Oxford. And so lots of work to be done around that. And so it's really exciting to now have it sort of birthed into the world and talking to lots of people about coming and joining the program. It's been really great.
Yeah, no, it's always exciting, especially when you're starting something out and knowing that the year two is actually going to happen. So
Yeah, indeed.
that's great news. So congrats on that. Yeah, this is we're recording this the Monday before Thanksgiving here in the States. So this week is I was walking around campus today, and my class is on Monday afternoons, evenings, and was quickly turning into a ghost town at Georgetown. So yeah, lots of folks heading out already, but yeah, gonna get my fill of turkey and all the goodie stuff on Thursday. So you know, nothing like 17 cooks in the kitchen and a bunch of stress trying to get a meal out with 18 side dishes and everything all at once. So good times. But no, I love Thanksgiving. It always it's kicking off the holiday season, so it's always
Indeed.
fun in the U.S. for that. So, but anyways, what is on the docket for today?
Well, as always, quite a lot. We're going to kick things off by looking at the COP 30 summit in Brazil, a notable COP, not least owing to the absence of the United States from the climate change summit. We're going to talk about the Saudi Crown Prince's visit to the White House. We're going to also looking at another summit. We're going to look at this past weekend's G20 summit in South Africa. And then we're going to have a little update on the American strikes on boats coming out of Venezuela, as many countries have now announced either a cutback or a complete halting of intelligence sharing with the United States in the Caribbean and beyond.
All right. Well, we'll kick things off with the recently concluded COP 30 in Brazil. And this was the annual UN Climate Summit held this year in Brazil's Amazon forest. And this is, it's hard to believe 30 years of climate talks. It's also the 10-year anniversary of the Paris Climate Accord. And but this time around, you think back 10 years ago to the Obama administration signing the historic Paris Accord and the, sort of optimism that went with that. But now we're coming to a time where there's sort of questions whether or not COP still matters. The U.S., as you noted, was not involved in COP 30 this year and has in fact pulled out of the Paris Accord now twice under President Trump and is the world's third largest emitter of greenhouse gases. And, it's not a good look for the U.S. 193 countries attended, including the Hermit Kingdom of North Korea. And Washington stayed away. So, there's been a lot of news about America's absence from the meetings, but that doesn't mean it doesn't go on. So, what happened? What did this look like? And from your perspective, was there progress made?
Yeah, well, look, exactly as you note, COP 30. This is a big one, and of course being hosted in Brazil, and not just anywhere in Brazil, but in Belém, which is right in the Amazon region. The Amazon rainforest are the lungs of the world. President Lula, the Brazilian president, came to power campaigning on preserving the Amazon, saving it from deforestation, and set, for this COP summit, the two main goals of these summits year after year is number one, reduce carbon emissions, and two, mitigate the effects of the damage wrought by climate change, particularly for poorer countries and those particularly exposed to rising sea levels. So a big summit, and obviously once again an important one. Just to it's, as you note, it's the 30th anniversary. So to sort of recap how we got there, the first COP was held in 1995, and then 2 years later there was the first big agreement, the Kyoto Protocol, when Japan hosted. And this was the first time that countries agreed to legally binding restrictions. Now, it only required reductions in emissions from developed countries. And so, here sort of the seeds were sown for a lot of the critique that particularly comes from the right of the climate change process. And so, by virtue of what was allowed under the Kyoto Accord, China and India in particular continue to grow rapidly, both in terms of economic size and, of course, in emissions output. And it's worth noting, of course, the US never ratified the Kyoto Accord. Zoom forward to 2015. This is the year that the French hosted in Paris. This is the year of the Paris Accord. And exactly as you said, this seemed like the big moment. There was so much optimism. This seemed like the turning point. All countries agreed to reduce emissions based on nationally determined targets and to contribute to mitigating the effects of climate change, and notably agreed to do everything they could to keep the rise in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. This is the magic number. Now, 10 years on, 10 years from the Paris Accord, simply put, to ask the very basic, straightforward question, how's it going? The answer is not well, dismally poorly. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres announced that we are hitting 1.5 degrees of warming, not in a few decades, but within a couple of years. And as we breeze past 1.5, we are very likely heading to 2 degrees, and 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. This is the danger zone. This is the tipping point of the climate crisis. This is when we see a massive reduction in the stability of the Arctic ice sheets. This is when the rainforests begin to collapse. This is when marine coral death accelerates and spreads, all of which then has an accelerant effect to heating. And so it's like not only is if the world were a car, not only are we still speeding out of control, our foot is still firmly on the accelerator. So we're not in a great place. Now, at the COP30, the goals remain the same. But when we look at the language, and I'll be really curious to hear your thoughts on this, not much was achieved. This was very much, in my estimation anyway, one of those lowest common denominator, watered down agreements. There is no note to keep to 1.5 degrees, and not a single mention of fossil fuels. And then exactly, as we noted at the top, the United States, absent. The American president, for the second time, pulled the United States out of the Paris Accord and refused to send a national delegation. Now, there were U.S. Leaders, governors, mayors, other city and state officials who were unofficially there as part of the U.S. Climate Alliance, but no national delegation. So that's sort of the brief history of how we got here, and indeed sort of how I see where we are, which I fear is anything but an optimistic view.
Yeah, and I guess a few takeaways that I think about when faced with this reality. The first being that a large part of me doesn't want to believe the fact that 1995 was 30 years ago. That's first and foremost. I think it also demonstrates the importance of love it or hate it. The importance of the United States still being involved in these sorts of things to get that leverage and that weight and that power involved in these sorts of things to bring other countries along. And when you don't have that in the room, there's nobody else still yet capable, willing to step up and like push other countries to really move forward on these sorts of things, and nobody else that has the weight to try to cajole countries to do this sort of thing. So that's going to be detrimental, for COP and climate change as long as an administration like this one is in power. Another key point, I think, and something to reiterate too, is you mentioned the 1.5 degrees Celsius, the 2 degrees Celsius, and those really are tipping points. And we get to a point, and we've done working groups on climate change in the Arctic and things before. And you get to a point where they don't, we hit these tipping points, and you really don't know what will happen because, certain things start happening with permafrost thawing, and it puts more carbon in the air because it stores so much carbon. And like we could hit these tipping points and they really are just that. And like things start to escalate even more than we've seen recently. So a lot of this stuff is just unknowns when we hit these certain marks. And that's kind of scary when you think about it. And but I do think on an optimistic note, you noted that while the administration didn't have anybody there, there were a number of US leaders there, city mayors, governors of more left-leaning Democratic states. And that's what we did during the first Trump administration. Like California took a major lead on this. And California is like the seventh or eighth largest economy in the world. So, having them there and them still pushing forward policies and actions that help to mitigate things is extremely important. So, it's not all doom and gloom. I think there is still going to be a lot of American governments at the state level that are going to be trying to adhere to some of the Paris Accord agreements and trying to mitigate climate change and things like that. So, there is still some activity on the United States side, but that's where it's going to be as long as the Trump administration is in power. And that's what we saw in the first administration as well. So, but again, there's limits on what they can do and what they can achieve. But unless we get the United States fully invested again, things are going to keep creeping up from a temperature standpoint.
Absolutely, and as encouraging as it is, and I agree with you entirely that at the sort of subnational level, you've got leadership there. I think your point's really well made. That it's the United States president that has the ability to cajole, to move, to negotiate others who might be less willing from around the world into an agreement. And this we were mentioning, of course, the Paris Accord, and we know how sizable the role of the United States was in actually making that happen. And so it's thinking diplomatically, that is you know, that is cannot be recovered or really effectively mitigated in the next 3 years.
Yeah, yeah. Without Obama directly negotiating with Xi Jinping before the Paris Peace Accord or before the Paris Climate Accord, that never would have happened.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Well, turning now to the visit of the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, to the White House. He visited Washington on the 18th of November, his first trip to Washington after 7 years of absence, and he got the full state visit treatment by President Trump. Now, of course, the context for his return and indeed for his absence really matters. MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, and Saudi Arabia earned a pariah status after the murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018. The U.S. Intelligence agencies, including the CIA, concluded that Mohammed bin Salman authorized a plan to kill or capture Khashoggi. Indeed, he was murdered in Istanbul in the Saudi embassy. And now he's very much back in the fold. And of course, in broader world politics, he's front and center when it comes to Middle East issues and the Abraham Accords, and indeed, as well, the uh, fragile ceasefire in Gaza. And look, the American president has been determined to get the United States closer to Saudi Arabia economically, and Mohammed bin Salman personally. And indeed, MBS himself wants quite a lot from the United States, particularly on the military and tech front. So, look, a notable return of MBS to Washington. Both leaders wanted to get quite a lot out of each other. Kelly, what went down?
Yeah, so I think this is important on a number of different levels with very large caveats. I think, from a stylistic and eye test scenario, this was good for both leaders. Trump hailed it as a win, got a lot of things that he loves to have, the big money, big ticket sort of investment from the Saudis. From MBS's side, just the fact that he was here obviously is a win for him and got the full, state dinner sort of treatment and things like that, is going to be a win for him, and sort of gets him back into, favorable society, so to speak. And at the same time, though, I think it's interesting what wasn't discussed. And for as much discussion as there has been over the past months and 2 years about the situation in Gaza, the Palestinian issue, there wasn't really a lot on that coming out of this meeting, which was surprising. But maybe not as well, because this was a lot about style, and a lot of words about substance. But, whether or not that actually happens is another question. So, I think, you mentioned the Khashoggi issue. Obviously, Saudi Arabia, MBS in particular, called a pariah by the Biden administration and Biden during the campaign. And Biden had to famously give the fist bump to MBS when the war in Ukraine started because of, the U.S. needed increased oil output from Saudi Arabia. And this time around, President Trump got the question about Khashoggi and, dismissed it, waved it off, basically saying that, quote, these things happen. And, MBS had to love hearing that. Looking further into what they talked about, it hit sort of the high notes on what both sides wanted and where they could find agreement. They signed a critical minerals framework, which obviously the Trump administration is rightly interested in. They agreed to engage on civil nuclear issues, which is something that Saudi Arabia really wants. And Trump greenlit the sale of NVIDIA's most advanced AI chips to Saudi Arabia's AI firms. And this is another area where both the Trump administration and MBS and the regime in Saudi Arabia want to expand. And Trump also got Mohammed bin Salman to announce even more investments in the U.S., up to $1 trillion. I did say a trillion with a T. MBS also got Trump to approve the sale of F-35 jets, fighter jets, to Saudi Arabia, which is a huge deal, that would upgrade their military capabilities. Also, the U.S. administration designated Saudi Arabia as a major non-NATO ally. And, but at the same time, delivery on all of these things is a little less certain than what it sounded like coming out of these meetings. Because, first of all, this investment stuff, Saudi Arabia is rich, but $1 trillion is a lot of money. And this isn't like, in FY27 that the Saudis are going to push $1 trillion into the U.S. economy. This is, if it even comes to fruition, we're talking decades here. So I wouldn't be holding our breath on that amount of money to actually materialize, but it looks good for Trump and like American business and things like that. On the F-35s, that's going to be a major issue and a major hurdle in Congress because of pro-Israel sentiment, Israeli pushback against Saudi Arabia getting these jets, but also on the F-35s and on the very high-level chips there's going to be pushback from Congress and some in the US on whether or not that's going to allow China in some ways to get access to technology because of their relationship with Saudi Arabia as well. So that's extremely uncertain, as is the civil nuclear cooperation because of Saudi Arabia's stance on nuclear technology and all of the hoops that countries need to jump through to get that technology. We're still a long way off of that happening. So I think there's a lot of rhetoric involved in this meeting, a lot of stylistic points that both sides were trying to get wins on. But at the end of the day, it, it, it remains to be seen what actually is going to come out of this meeting, and especially on defense cooperation and the non-NATO ally thing. They didn't release the exact terms of this. Does this mean that we will come to the defense of Saudi Arabia if they are attacked? Hard to say, right? And famously, they were attacked by Iran in 2019, and Trump didn't do anything. So I think a lot of this is for show. Obviously, Trump had to give the Saudis something after claiming that they would come to the defense of Qatar after Israel attacked them. Moving forward, we would do that. So I think he had to give them something. Now, what the details are remains to be seen. But again, like I said, some of the biggest issues that weren't talked about in detail were the Gaza situation, Palestinian statehood, and the Abraham Accords. MBS is still sticking very tightly to his line that there needs to be a viable path towards Palestinian statehood before he will even consider signing on to the Abraham Accords. And I haven't seen anything that moves him off of that stance because of anything that's happened recently or because of this visit last week. So we'll see. But it was a good visit. I think Trump had things he can take out of this that were wins for him. MBS had wins out of this as well. But what it means at the end of the day for tangible results are still remain to be seen and may end up being few and far between.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you entirely, and particularly when it comes to the situation in Gaza and the question of a two-state solution. MBS has been resolute on that, and that really does seem to be a massive omission from the meeting. And frankly, if Donald Trump wants that Nobel Peace Prize, which he so badly covets, yeah, something's got to give if he's going to give if he's going to get Saudi Arabia to join the Abraham Accords. And like you say, tough to say sort of where things will actually fall on substance. But what we can say, I think, is just the sort of the performance of this meeting in and of itself is significant. MBS very much wanted to be seen as chummy with the U.S. president. Certainly achieved that. And Saudi Arabia seems like a very close friend of the United States at a moment when the Middle East and its politics are in flux.
Yeah, and to your point on Gaza as well, I'm sure that was, because of the nature of this meeting and what they wanted to get out of it, it was probably specifically left off the table for the most part because they knew they weren't going to agree on that. And they wanted to come out of this, sort of in a holding hands, kumbaya sort of state. And they knew that too much discussion on that, too much emphasis on Gaza and Palestine was going to detract from that. All right, moving on to the G20 summit. We're getting right into Tristen's wheelhouse on this one. So on November 22nd and 23rd, we had the annual G20 Leaders Summit hosted this year in South Africa, and this was the 20th G20 meeting. And yet again, as with COP30, the United States was absent. President Trump and his administration were protesting what they call genocide of white Afrikaners in the country, which we covered back when President Ramaphosa visited the White House earlier this year. So, Tristen, this has been a busy week for you in the world of summits. What happened at the G20? And, how is more broadly, multilateralism faring in our current atmosphere?
I really feel that my role on this podcast so often is being the one that just lacks hope, optimism. And yet, once again, I have to respond by saying, how is multilateralism faring? Poorly, very, very poorly. It's so the G20, unlike COP, is not about a single particular issue, but it does, by design, or at least what's become design, allow countries to get together and discuss a wide array of topics. Now, this wasn't always the way that it was. The G20 starts in the late 1990s at the finance ministers level. It begins singularly focused on financial crises. It's elevated to the leaders level in 2008 in the wake of and in response to the global financial crisis, and again is very focused on resolving the global financial crisis and mitigating the worst of its possible effects. It works, it functions as a crisis committee, and I would argue functioned exceptionally well in that role. Now, as you said, this is a sort of a big moment for the G20 at the leaders level. South Africa hosts first summit on the African continent, and indeed this marks the end of what we call the summit cycle. So now every single member of the summit has hosted, and that means we will return to the original summit host next year. It's the United States. Curiously, notably absent, as you mentioned, this year, and next year it will be hosted by the United States at of course a Trump golf course down in Florida. And if that doesn't communicate a lot about where we are in the world, I don't know what does. In terms of what was actually agreed at the G20, what went down at the G20, I've been asked repeatedly over this weekend, what does America's absence really mean? Well, in one respect, it meant that it was relatively easy for the G20 to reach an agreement.
Sadly, yes.
Sadly, and this year, quite extraordinarily, the summit president Cyril Ramaphosa opened the summit declaring that they had an agreement, which is it's a bold move
Yeah.
for a director to start a film with the ending,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And so I mean, look, there's other things that I certainly read into that, and I remember India did something very similar a couple of years ago, where they announced even before the leaders had actually arrived that it's like, oh no, we've got an agreement, we're good to go. One of the things that really strikes me about this is, yeah, okay, on the one hand, look, this is unprecedented, we've got an agreement, isn't this wonderful? But it is fodder for the group of people who say, look, these are just talk shops. They don't matter. Why are we spending all this money, all this time, when the leaders don't need to be there to negotiate anything? It's all cooked well in advance.
Right. Yeah.
And, I mean, we could spend all podcast, and I promise I won't, talking about that. But it is, it's one of these things that was sort of heralded triumphantly, certainly by the South African presidency, but it's actually something that sends up alarm bells to me as somebody who really believes that summitry and multilateralism is not just an effective tool in international politics and diplomacy, but indeed a necessary one. What was agreed, honestly, of substance, not much. Again, like there is very little to be excited about in the agreement that's big and substantive and is really going to change things. What the G20 was useful for this year is, as it has been. I know you and I have spoken about this. I'm thinking even at last year's summit, or around last year's summit, it is a convening mechanism. It brings leaders from around the world together to meet face to face. And, this G20 summit, once again, it seems to me, was about what happened on the sidelines, and it's very much about the interested parties discussing this leaked Ukraine peace plan in person together. This seems to be, what this summit really, will if we're going to remember it at all, what we'll likely remember it for.
Which, also just adding a little, spoiler for our next episode, we will be diving into, the, Russia-Ukraine, peace deal in our next episode.
Yeah, and so just like again, I don't want to be unfair to the South African presidency. They did a spectacular job as hosts and as conveners, as the presidency of this process over the past year. The communique did run 122 points long, highlighting a load of very important priorities to South Africa and the African continent in particular, particularly with a focus on developing country debt. But again, as good as these words are, when we think of the G20 process in a broader way, not just sort of something that happens once and then, well, we'll meet again next year, like the subsequent host of the summit has to pick this up, has to pick up this document and run with it, has to pick up these agreements and say, okay, let's walk these down the field. Let's advance on this. And frankly, again, it just doesn't look good. I'm not hopeful. I'm not optimistic when the next president of the G20, or rather the country that holds the presidency, is the United States. It will be President Trump that is the chair of the G20. One refused to send a delegation, and indeed, first time in G20 history that a country said, "Nope, we're out. We're not doing it." And then, second, has this open hostility to South Africa. It seems the South African Prime Minister in particular. So we'll see if how much of the South African communique is picked up and advanced by the Americans next year. But I hope that I am pleasantly surprised. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't bode well for the 2026 G20, and that's for sure. And who knows where we will be in the world of foreign policy and international affairs a year from now, and whether or not the United States even goes through with hosting the G20 in 2026, because there's always that possibility as well.
So finally, this week we wanted to revisit the topic of the U.S. military strikes on suspected drug boats in the Caribbean. A number of U.S. partners and allies have started to react. The United Kingdom, Canada, the Netherlands have all said that they are distancing themselves from U.S. intelligence and operations focused on the region. Uh, Kelly, how big a deal is that? The American administration has certainly brushed it off, but how important are these intelligence connections? One generally, and two particularly for these operations that the U.S. is engaged in now.
Yeah, I think this is a really big deal, because it opens the door to further restrictions on intelligence sharing moving forward. And I was actually quoted in Politico earlier in the year, when the second Trump administration started, because there was murmurings of the idea that perhaps some of our allies in the Five Eyes and European allies may not share all of the information with the Trump administration. And I kind of passed it off saying that, like, that'll be kind of difficult to do. And still holds true, they get more from us than we get from them. I'm not trying to downplay the importance of the Five Eyes and the other partners that we share intelligence with, but, like, the US is the elephant in the room, right? We have the largest intel community, the most money spent on it, the most assets all that kind of stuff. So, we are producing the largest amount of this stuff, but we still do rely in some major instances on intel from other partners. And there's also intel analysts from other countries that are allies embedded in the US intelligence community and in the military intelligence and things like that. So stopping this is not an easy thing to do necessarily, and it is coming down from, like, the highest levels of governments to do this sort of thing. But I think it's important because one, in regard to this specific issue, it kind of reiterates that it doesn't necessarily pass the smell test for some of these countries, the legality of it. And secondly, this region of the world was for a long time held a lot of British colonies, and they, still have strong ties with a lot of Caribbean nations. So they have a history of having intel collection capability in this region. So we are at risk of losing some important intel, but especially in regard to Colombia, because of the close cooperation the United States has had with Colombia since the 1990s, and the hunt for Pablo Escobar and like everything that was going on in the 90s, and then Plan Colombia and the negotiations between Colombian government and the FARC and all this kind of stuff, this close cooperation the U.S. has had with them. So it is a big deal. And, I think it could start the U.S. on a slippery slope where, these countries do it once, they get more comfortable not sharing because of a number of different fears with what could be done with it or not done with it by this administration. It also, speaking to the larger issue of Venezuela right now, like obviously the Gerald Ford aircraft carrier has now arrived. We have massive assets in the region right now. 10% of the U.S. Navy is in the Caribbean right now. And, I kind of think of it as like the Manhattan Project, right? You're not going to build the bomb unless you're going to use it when you go to all that trouble. And I'm really fearful that in the coming weeks, we will see U.S. Military activity on the mainland in Venezuela in an effort to get rid of Maduro. And I think, what this demonstrates from the IC sharing side of things is that our partners don't believe in the legality of this, and they also don't believe in the feasibility of overthrowing Maduro and not creating a situation that is just worse because you have, a number of factions vying for power and things of that nature. Now, obviously, the Venezuelan people have gone to the polls multiple times now and said they don't want the Maduro regime in power, but that's a different beast than overthrowing Maduro and then just kind of letting things play out and see what happens. Because there's still a lot of interested parties that are power brokers in Venezuela that go beyond just Maduro. So this is going to be something that's going to be watched extremely closely in the coming weeks and months, and it has a vast probability of going poorly on many different levels.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really is hard not to see this as a prelude to something much bigger and something that goes well beyond drug smuggling or apparent drug smuggling coming out of Venezuela.
Right. And the administration's tying Maduro to these drug networks so that they can, classify him as a narco terrorist, gives them some sort of legal justification now to go after him, or, they're thinking of a legal justification. So, you can kind of see the openings that have been created and where this is kind of going and leaning towards. So not, as awful as Maduro is, as awful as his administration is, I just don't see how this ends well in the near to medium term if you try to overthrow him. And I just go back to the, ironically, coming from Colin Powell, his Pottery Barn dictum of like, if you break it, you bought it. I don't see this administration thinking in those terms of, now it's our responsibility to go in and try to stabilize the situation, even if that would be possible, right? We've seen in the past that isn't always possible. So yeah, I'm not optimistic about the situation in Venezuela right now.
Well, it is almost certainly yet again something that we'll be returning to in a couple of weeks' time.
All right. Well, that wraps things up for this week. And thank you for listening to this episode of Headlines in History, and happy Thanksgiving for those of you who celebrate. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Abdalla Nasef. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow the podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @geodiplomacy, and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.